to issues of experience and two-dimensional representation, and whether or not certain modes that we use in architecture and in general use correspond to our experience of the world. And actually, as it's developed, I'm getting more into whether there really is no natural, instinctual experience of the world once we've lived life past a certain age, and that any type of seeing is learned at some point. But that architecture really is fixated on some very strict approaches to how we see the world, and that once you pass certain stages of architectural training, you do see the world in orthography and essentially coordinate geometry. So I'm going to read a couple small bits of this, and I won't do this consistently, it's just because a couple of them put words better to it. Designers thinking stringently obey specified viewpoints, plan, elevation, section, and to a lesser extent perspective, find the pictorial arenas of the designer's imagination. Method has linguistic consequences, and thought is trained in plan, elevation, section, and perspective. Yet our experience of space is fluid and specific to every person and every position. But this isn't the info. We're going to pass over these, and I'll read it real quick. All visual experience is trained. At some stage of infancy, before exposure to represented image, there's a brief moment of purely innate visual experience. The instant that we are exposed to a two-dimensional image, any surface that we understand to correspond in likeness with the three-dimensional, we begin to understand direct experience with the agenda of the flat image. Learning may begin with reflection in glass and fluid. They themselves inspired the measured techniques developed by Renaissance artists. It continues with exposure to and training in various modes of informal drawing, calibrated representation, emotional reproduction, and digital representations and manipulations. We understand our world differently as we learn to see. This is true for all people, designers and non-designers alike. It begins immediately after birth when we learn to see the world as we draw it. So what I'm going to be delving into, hopefully this semester, is a look at organizing the modes that we have of depicting the world, either through motion photograph and lithograph or silkscreen, through structured drawing modes like perspective and elevation section, and informal drawing modes like sketch. I believe that they all set up a framework for understanding the world that I want to dissect. And this is in the context of a larger look at design as occurring mainly as an idea, that any architectural project actually exists primarily as an idea that finds different manifestations either through representation, which is this next tier, through a built object, which is actually a derivative of the representation. And the representation itself is a derivative of the original idea that exists in the designer's head. And then photography at some point, which is a documentation that is completely static, and that documents only a moment of a built object's life. So these are that the modes of representation, building, photograph are all instances of the existence or manifestation of an architectural idea. But as a building is thought through, we can try the right slide. Now you're behind. Well, these should layer up actually. But if we think about the evolution of building, right, or a design project, layered over with the idea of, or with the concept of design occurring as idea, representation, building, and photograph. Design exists originally as an idea, and may exist in structured orthography, or it may exist in looser diagrams that don't belong to any single perspective. But quickly it's brought into sketch modes, constructed ways of drawing, which place it in a coordinate scheme. And the next step in the life of an architectural project, it's correlated with real-world data, which is always conceived of as a coordinate relationship. So that's never built on spatial understanding of the world as we see it. It's built on physical, documented relationships between objects in the world in a very numerical way. In the later design process, it takes on further imaginary modes in either manual or digital drawing, or in simulated three-dimensional construction. And the photographs come in at that stage as well. I'm not sure what that is, but as we go through the life of the building, it becomes a built object. And then at some point, things are constructed around that built object. So that phenomenon of this built object is now interpreted later through either informal photographs, through sort of more composed and structured ways of taking photography, or to the extreme architectural photography, which is actually the mode I've been working in this winter. So if I was to take all of these, I intend to dissect each of these phases in their own right over the course of the next 4 weeks or so, and to come up with a series of images that let me say, okay, if I'm working in photography as either a precedent or as a data gathering, I want to do it in a specific manner. And I think this is most appropriate as a correlation to how we may experience space. Similarly, or actually, to get into those, this is actually the structure I would go through, right, is that there are groupings across a person's life, and this obviously correlates to some degree with what happens in the life of a project. There's a period where we think through untrained drawing, and that exists in children. In pre-Renaissance art, we see a lot of the same traits. There's a sense that things descend in scale when they go into distance in the page. Sort of the varying perspectives that exist in mind at that age for children existed as a normative framework for drawing in a certain era. That needs to be dealt with in much greater detail. But what I've dealt with this winter is in either 4x5 photography or, in the past week, perspective control lenses, is to say that casual photographs, say the one at the left is not corrected perspectively. The one at the right actually has a manipulation of the lens back that gives a structured sense of how we're interpreting that object. So we may begin a design process typically with an image like at the left, which actually has an angling to everything, where lines decline in space. A structured approach to that actually gives you an elevation, right? And the space in between those is the departure of casual observance versus something that's structured around orthography and our architectural notion of that. I did a series of investigations that looked at that. Something also about how can the represented image sort of lead off across a page. And then I got into thinking about captured images that are already existing in and of their own right and are printed in our artifacts, that we work from objects like that, but that there may be manipulations in the system camera. It's a lot easier to use Photoshop, obviously. But we can manipulate that to actually try and correct perspective in things that are already an artifact or a derivative of the original experience. And then our view is actually distorted in those ways. And then overlapping those shows you the distance between something that's uncorrected and something that's to some extent corrected. And then I've been getting into issues since I've been focusing on the phase of representation in photography, that we have a normal lens like 50 millimeters corresponds to our magnification of the eye. When you take a wide-angle lens and take a image of space, the distortion that comes with it and the change in object relationships don't relate to our visual experience. So, that shows a great length. So one of my goals here has been to try and document the space and photograph in a way that feels like it corresponds to our visual experience, which is actually something very different than just taking a photograph or, I'll go through the images. So taking a 4x5 where I can actually alter the relationship of the film to the lens, taking a space like this, which is actually downtown Providence, and saying that using tilt and shift, I can actually suppose that one side is actually more elevational. Right? So that perhaps as we look at space, Photoshop could do this for us and actually construct it around our notions of how perspective should be drawn, with very straight lines that descend into space. But if we go back to something that's drawn directly with the same camera setting from the same viewpoint, we may end up with something that has some of those qualities, but things actually don't descend as dramatically as Photoshop would want us to. When I say Photoshop, not because it's it is a standard of our day, but it actually uses the lessons of earlier. Anyway, I'll go really quick. And we may actually have an elevational experience of things that are at our periphery. It's really the goal of this. This is actually digital with a perspective control lens, but that the relationship at this plane versus this plane is there's a complete something very different going on. These are all constructed with 3 frames. 1, 2, 3. Actually, not that way, but all just a turn of the tripod. So with subtle tilt and shift, that's very subtle because it's actually with a digital lens that doesn't allow much. But and if we go back to that one, the very subtle shift, but it is a change in our experience of that from something that is a little bit more perspectival to something that's more elevational. And these all have to be no change in the vantage point, right? The vantage point in all of these is consistent between sets of images. So then going back to an idea of the 50 millimeter lens, so this would be a straight shot, this one's digital, with a 50 millimeter lens, and that's really the field of view that we would have with that, while maintaining relationships that are true to how we see things. So say 160 images may give us a casual feel of what it feels like to be in space. And this is just a collaged piece. Digital techniques can make this very strict perspectively, but it's just a collage that I think at least gives us an indication that when we experience space, assuming we can say that this is somewhat true to how we see, elevation, not section, but elevation and multiple modes of perspective may exist simultaneously in our visual experience. Right? That somewhere in how we process the world that we're in, we may experience elevation at our left in mind, just as even though things are actually descending in space, we may experience things to our left in elevation. This is just conscious of lens shift, right? Simply the lens at the front end shifting. This would be the digital mode. So I've been trying to. This is getting towards the end. I won't go on forever, but I should actually flip the two in the middle. But thinking of lens shift as occurring in X and Y dimensions, and not as a Z shift. Right? So a change in the X direction in a positive of the lens is going to have a certain effect, and a change in the negative direction will have a certain effect, and the same for positive and negative in the Y. So if I was to say, just at a straight normal view, like I showed before, where I just pan and maintain the lens relationship to the sensor, I might end up with that image, right? And this is returning to the same site. It's a well-documented warehouse in the city of Providence. But a single change in the Y dimension, all positive in that way, and it's very subtle because of the limitations of this lens, right? A 4x5, it's very tough to calibrate, but if I was able to achieve that, it would be more dramatic. But these are all shifts of our relation to that in some way. So to layer that a little bit, since my goal has been to try and figure out if there's a way that I can take on photography to inform design in a way that feels truer to something closer to what I might say is an innate experience of space, even though that's really caught up in issues of how we remember how to see in perspective. Say that there was a Y shift on the periphery of this image. We get that, which is a little bit more, actually descends, I think, a little bit deeper in space, that we end up with less perspectival loss. If we did a negative change in the Y, we end up with something that just sort of exploded. But if we end up with a negative shift in the X in the middle and a positive shift in the Y, it means something that is a pretty dramatically different image. And that might look like the pan is different, but this has all been undertaken pretty carefully to make sure that the shift point from that image is always only one frame away. So 3 frames away from what was considered my center point in this results in something that's a little bit more either elevational or perspectival. And then photography also allows for questions of scale. So this goes back to the image that I didn't take, but that everything is full scale. Right? That we have notions in architecture, and this might fit into a different chapter of what it has become, but we have certain notions that things that are further away take on different senses of detail in our thinking and in how we consider them and how we would imagine them in our design idea. But in reality, everything is full scale. So if I took an image like that in New York, there are water towers everywhere that are fairly the same size. So that tiny dot in the distance is exactly the same object as the one that's close. Same can go for Providence. I mean, those aren't all the normative scale, but with a 4x5, there's enough detail to delve in there and say, even though these aren't going to be the same height, they're going to vary across the city, there's a relationship between all of those, and though we see that and would consider this with far less consideration in our viewpoint, there's a relationship to things that are much closer that's exactly the same to our body. And I think that, I know this is all huge landscape shots, so it feels a little silly, but for something that's closer, I think the implications for design are a little more significant. It's the same image, very different scale shifts, but that's as much full scale on the right image as if we didn't think it was here, but it actually is. And the same can be true for something that's more urban shot. Right? But that's actually full scale, but looking at the image at the left originally, we would not consider that as something that's full scale. And this was an earlier thing, 2 slides away from the end, but originally I was taking these and saying there are certain modes, right? There's documentation from the world that we take on in architecture when we do site investigation. We see it in coordinate geometry. That's an abstract framework we're applying. It's one that not only are we applying in that instance, it becomes our mode of thinking. The next step is through representation. Through representation that again follows those strict coordinate relationships, which we call orthogonal relationships. So the abstraction that was documented gets put into a drawing mode. At some point when we step into designing, when we consider the things that we have documented